Welcome to everyone to the last of Stannary's 2019 Burgundy en Primeur tastings. I hope everyone has enjoyed ones before then. Jason's going to look back at them a little bit. But tonight, the focus is on value in Burgundy, which becomes more and more of a pertinent subject as prices go up in the renowned villages. So for us, it becomes hugely important for drinkers, for the restaurant side of the business, to find where the value is. And tonight we're going to explore that. We'll be looking at some winemakers who are undiscovered and some of the villages that are less well known. One little tweak on the tasting order is that the Santenay will be the first red wine that you will taste. So we are Montagny, Santenay, Auxey, Mercurey, Pommard, and finishing on the Volnay. We have at least one winemaker with us. Welcome to Gilles Lafouge. Thank you for joining us. And Xavier HORIOT is also trying to, but he keeps losing his connection. But his wine is the penultimate one, so hopefully we will have him by then. But I will pass on to Jason to look back slightly on it and to talk about this evening.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome. As Sam said, this is the last of our 8 Zoom tastings that we've done. We've pretty much covered all of the Côte d'Or now, and we're just venturing down a little bit to the Chardonnay this evening. It's been really fascinating, actually. I mean, hopefully it has been for you as well. When I taste the wines in barrel at the Domaines, you form an interesting impression, and you're never quite sure whether you're 100% right or not. So it's been really reassuring to taste the wines again and actually find that they are as good as I thought they were. I think some of the things that have come across over these series of tastings are, we've talked about the heat quite a lot, but I think perhaps that's been overstated compared to the dryness of the vintage. I think the lack of water, lack of rain was arguably the most important thing in this vintage. And as a result of that, you could say the importance of old vines has probably played an even bigger role than ever before. Obviously, the old vines with the deep roots can go down and find what moisture there is. And I think they certainly suffered a lot less than vines that were maybe planted 10 or 15 years ago. Perhaps would have slightly shut down in terms of maturation. Might have just struggled a little bit to reach proper phenolic maturation, even though the sugars would have been very high due to the heat. So I think that's been really important. The other thing, I think the importance of organic and biodynamic farming. Again, I think that it's a bit like when you take medicine. I think if you take, as a human, if you take medicine every day, somehow you have less natural resistance to illness. And I find people who take medicines more tend to be iller than anyone else I know. So I think if you, in the same way, if you're not pumping vineyards full of chemicals, I think they are much more resilient and much more able to adapt to extremes of temperature and certainly extremes of dryness and wetness. So I think that's also played a really crucial role. And the other thing that I probably noticed more during these tastings than when I was in Burgundy, but the richness of the vintage has allowed winemakers to, or the ripeness of the grapes, has allowed winemakers to be that much more gentle in their vinification. There hasn't been that need to really extract or push the wines a little bit too far, which when you do that, obviously you're going to extract some slightly less welcome tannins, a little bit more greenness, and a little bit more rusticity. And I think in 2019, people have reduced the amount of pigeage that they've done. There's been a lot more pumping over, and we're literally pumping the juice from the bottom of the vat up to the top and putting it on top of the cap. And that, keeps the berries, I think, whole for a little bit longer, and it's just, you get much more aromatic character to the wine than if you're doing really heavy extraction. So I think we've seen that a lot, and I think for winemakers it's been great. What they do going forward, whether they're able to find a way to continue that more gentle approach, will be really interesting. And then I think the last thing that's been very evident has been the absolute importance of picking dates. There's been a lot of variation. Some people were picking, as late as, well, I say as late, we're still in September, but as late as 24th, 25th of September. But then other people, certainly the white winemakers, were picking around the 5th or 6th of September. So that's a big spread to begin picking. But the key element is that you find when people used to begin harvesting in October, when it was less warm, there was less sun around, if you waited for an extra couple of days, the sugars wouldn't have increased that much. Yeah? So actually it was getting the exact date right was less crucial. You could, whether it was the 15th of October or the 17th, it didn't really matter. But the difference between the 5th of September and the 8th of September can be massive. And I remember when we had Alex Morrow on, he was saying he pulled forward the date of the vintage, I think 3 or 4 times, just because every day or so the sugars were increasing. And so very, very easy in a vintage like this to pick too late, and suddenly that balance has gone and the fruit can become a little bit jammy. So I think everyone pretty much got it right. Certainly all the wines we've tasted this week have been, this month have been incredibly balanced and fresh. And what the really curious thing was that we said that in 2018, the generous size of the vintage helped keep the freshness of the wine. So it's actually gone the other way this year. The small size of the vintage has helped keep the freshness because everything inside these little berries has been concentrated. So not just the fruit and the tannins, but also the acidity. So the pH levels have actually been really quite good. When we talk about pH, we need pH to be relatively low. And they've probably been lower than they were in 2018. So there is still this sense of vitality and freshness, despite evident richness. And certainly with the white wines, there's been amazing dry extract. I think I've never wines that are so mouth-watering and yet so intense at the same time, quite extraordinary. So to sum up, really, I suppose a great vintage in both red and whites, lots of surprises, and the sort of vintage I really don't think could have been made 20 years ago had these weird conditions happened, and the sort of vintage that I don't think we can compare to anything else. It's got a bit of this and a bit of that, a little bit of 2010 freshness maybe, a little bit of 17 juiciness, but there's no one vintage that this resembles. So I think it's been really important we've all got to taste and hopefully got a good idea of the style of the vintage. I'm delighted to see we now have the second winemaker in place, Xavier. Nice to see you this evening. We might just need to unmute you there, I think, if we can. Let's make sure we can.
You hear me?
We can hear you loud and clear. That's great. Good to have you along, Xavier.
Good evening, everybody.
Just before we move into the first wine, I just asked both. I'll start with you, Xavier, as you're online. We had you earlier in the series when we were tasting your Pommard Chaponier, which was delightful. We really talked about Pommard more than anything in that tasting. I just want to touch a little bit on your two special cuvées, Chambertin and La Trissière Chambertin. How good are those wines in 2019? Was when you got vineyards of that quality, was it very easy to produce grapefruit?
Yes, it was an easy vintage. The only problem was as it was very hot, and also we had to wait for the maturity until the beginning of September. The problem was that we were very focused on the juice we could have, because we know that starting from at September we will have the maturity, but it was not yet done, so we had to wait. So we were focused on not losing too much juice, but the quality was there, and also it was there were no disease on everywhere, but it was very hot and we had to wait. For example, I went to Chambertin the 15th of September, so really different from previous year or 2020. So it was a really special year, very sunny, but also we had to wait some maturity.
It must have been quite frustrating to be waiting for the maturity, but watching the amount of juice slowly get smaller and smaller. So knowing you have to wait for the quality, but knowing that you would make less wine.
Yes, but also at a moment you have to take the decision to not be only focused on waiting to have the analysis, perfect analysis, because after, even with a good sorting, you could have dry berries that could impact almost the rest with the perfect maturity. So the always good decision, I think, it's to choose in a compromise, not wait the best thing. You know, you also rely on your samples that you make manually. So it's not perfect. It's not always representative of all the vineyards. Now I'm less focused on analyze. I bet on a compromise.
Thank you, Xavier. Well, we'll come back to you a little bit later. We're going to be tasting your Pommard Les Perrieres a little bit later on. Gilles, if I could just introduce you to everyone. Good evening. We'll take off, make sure people can hear what you say.
Hello, everybody.
Welcome. This is the first time that we've had your wines to sell. Actually, obviously, it was as a result of it was very sadly the sad death of Hilary and the purchase of Domaine direct, and we're obviously delighted to have you and your wines sort of join the list. And I think it's great credit to Hilary that she found someone who makes such wonderful wines as you. When we went to visit you for the first time in July, just after the confinement, the lockdown had finished, I was blown away by the quality of the wines you were making. I just wanted to ask you, really, we've talked a little bit about the climat qui chauffe, the climate change. For me, that seems to have had a really big impact on certain appellations. Xavier, who makes Pommard, he will probably, Pommard has certainly benefited from the riper, warmer summers and riper grapes. It seems Saint-Romain, Auxey-Duresses especially, have really had a good few years.
Yes, for the moment, with the little changement of the climate, it's good for us now. But we can see different. We make now different wine like 1970 or 1980 year, 1980 or 1970 in the past. You are difficult, good maturities. You on now for us it's more easy because each year we have good maturity on not very hot degree, but a very good balance. On it's good, but we hope it's not high temperature in the future.
Yes, I think we all agree. If climate change could stop today, it would be perfect. Because we've reached a really good level of sunshine and ripeness, but we don't want it to go any higher. I would imagine when your father was making the wines before you, he would often presumably harvest well into October.
Yes. Mm-hmm. In the past, my father cut the grape in October and end of September, generally end of September. But now Usually, the harvest is 15th of September. On the more early year, like 18 or 20, the harvest is very early. In Auxey-Duresses, it's a special climate because we stay in a small valley, east-west, and we have a lot of little more fresh wind, and we more acidity stay in the grape, and we have a good balance with this climate, very special in our valley.
Because you've had greater ripeness in your grapes, have you found with the wine making you could be more gentle, less pushing for more extraction, and so having a more gentle extraction?
Can you repeat in French, because I don't understand. In French, what is?
Ouais, avec l'été le plus chaud qu'avant.
Oui.
Maintenant, vous pouvez faire une extraction beaucoup plus légère qu'avant parce que les raisins sont plus mûrs.
Yes, exactly. The vinification is different now because in the past we must found the good color, some tannin, some structure for the baby wine. But now the grape are very good maturity, and we must be very slowly with extraction. In the Domaine, we don't like more extracted wine. We like sweet, elegant wine. And in 19 and this year, 20, we make vinification without pigeage. Only pumping up. Is that remontage?
Yeah. Pumping over. Yeah.
You must be careful with too much extraction, because after you have a lot of tannin and you lose the freshness and the fine of the Pinot Noir. Yeah. Sorry, my English is very bad.
We understand you perfectly. Thank you, Gilles, for now. We'll return to you a little bit later, but I think it's probably time to get going with the tasting. So the first wine, just to warn everyone, be very careful, because the first wine is the only 2018, in fact, the only 2018 of the whole series. But the 2019 was not bottled, not really ready. So Bruno Lorenzon suggested we look at the 2018. I mean, Lorenzon was another Domaine direct domain that we very gratefully inherited back in the summer. And again, I went out there for the first time in July, and probably one of the most exciting tastings I think I've ever had. Bruno is quite an extraordinary man, amazing passion and intensity, and I think that really comes across in the wines as well. We've moved further south, so if you think of Mercurey, then Climat, then Chassière, then Santenay, then you're moving into Rouly and Mercurey. So you're in the Chalonnais now rather than the Côte de Beaune. And Bruno is based in Mercurey, although he also makes quite a few different cuvées of Montagny, which again is a little further south and Mercurey. He has about 9 hectares in total, six of which are red and 3 are white. He also makes white Mercurey, which is relatively unusual. Mercury is probably better known for its Pinot Noirs. So we're looking at the 2018, so we've got to get the idea of 19 out of our heads. 18 was a bigger, more generous vintage, of course, but again, had a really nice acidity, although it was warm. generosity of the vintage almost dissipated the heat, if you like, and the freshness levels remain really good. This is particularly fresh because it's right at the top of the hill on really, really chalky soil. I remember tasting this. I look back at my notes today, and it actually reminded me of, it was almost Chablis-like, I felt, with hints of Bellini about it, which for Montagny is unusual. Whether it will taste like that this evening, who knows? Something that Bruno said that was really interesting, though. He does a lot of work in the cellars. He says most of the work is done in the vineyards. That's where his great wines are made. And he's worked out that on average in Burgundy, about 250 hours per hectare is spent on vineyards. And at his domain, it's 750. So it's 3 times as much. It would be interesting to ask both Gilles and Xavier later if they know how many hours they spend. But that seems extraordinarily high. And it's all about really getting the best quality fruit. He trains his vines a little bit higher so they get maximum photosynthesis, which will allow them to reach really good phenolic maturity, perhaps without sugars going crazy. He doesn't like to chaptalize ever, and of course also doesn't like to acidify, so they're very natural grapes in that sense. He uses about 15% new oak, and that's it really. So let's see what it tastes like. The good news is it does taste quite similar to before. There's certainly plenty of chalkiness, plenty of raciness there. Particularly on the nose, that's where I think the real chalkiness, that slight flintiness comes through. This wine, I say, was bottled about 6 months ago, so it will be slightly different to the other wines in that sense. But there is a natural, easy concentration, but a real vitality. Montagny is funny. There's not much Montagny Village. It is almost all Premier Cru, which is an unusual situation. So in a way, don't get fooled by the fact that it says Premier Cru on the label.
Jason, can I ask a question on these villages? From your perspective, your adult career has all been working in Burgundy. How have the Montagnys, the Mercureys, the Auxeys, how have they changed in that time? Quality up? Were they sought after? Were you selling them back in the day? Yeah, could you tell us a bit of the story?
Yeah, I think they were always very saleable, but really based on price rather than quality. People wanting something a little bit more affordable. But I think with the new generation of winemakers over the last 25 years, they've become a little bit more ambitious. We've always said, generally winemakers are much more open, they talk to each other a lot more, share ideas. And I think it's all about raising the collective level. So if you have, I mean, we've seen that particularly in Chassière, which is quite an open village, they definitely share ideas. The overall standard has just slowly risen. You know, they're not sort of around their pot of or their cuve saying, "Oh, I'm not going to tell you what I'm doing." And I think they see the sort of greater good for everyone, really. So I think, to a certain degree, you could argue we never really knew what Montagny could achieve until someone really ambitious pushes the boundaries or pushes the envelopes, as people say. And I think Bruno has certainly done that. I mean, as I say, he does make some Mercurey as well, red and white. But I think if you were tasting this blind, you'd be somewhere slightly grander, you know, possibly in Pollini, possibly maybe not Chassagne, but perhaps not quite as rich as that. But the sort of purity of fruit there. As I say, it's a shame we can't taste the 2019. I think we'd probably find just a little bit more extract and a little bit more just depth on the finish. But I think this is still pretty serious wine.
Do you know how they managed to end up with quite so much Premier Cru? Was Henri Gouge part of that, or?
No, I don't know. It is odd whether someone of influence had a lot of vineyards there and wanted to make them all Premier Cru. I'm really not sure. But I I think I've tasted 1 or 2 village Montagnys in my time, and everything else has been Premier Cru. So, so there we go. That's our one look at 2018. I think we're going to be offering this evening and in the offer the 2019. But I think that's, as I say, I've tasted a lot of Montagnys in my time, and I think that's a pretty serious example. And Bruno is one of the most fantastic winemakers in that village, I think, around. So I would advise you to get stuck in. Let's leave the whites now and move on to the reds and to 2019. And before we come back to Gilles for his Auxey-Duresses, which is going to be the second red wine, we're going to have a look at the Santenay Vieilles from Thomas Morey. Now, we already had about 5 or 6 producers in Chassière, so it would be a really good idea to have 5 or 6 more. So I think we now have about 10 Chassière producers. But we're really lucky because they're all really good. We tasted Pommard's Chassière, one of his Chassière Premier Crus earlier in the series, and it was looking really, really good. He split with his brother from his father. So father Bernard Morey is very, very well known, very respected winemaker. And Vincent and Thomas went their separate ways. They literally cut the vineyards in half. So if you look through their current portfolio, it's pretty much the same. So they each have a little bit of Ombrezé, each have a little bit of Santenay, for example. But that's probably where the similarities end. They tasted it both, and the wines are very, very different. The key here with Pommard is probably the picking pace. He picks quite a bit earlier than his brother. He likes the wines to have a vibrancy and a sort of tautness, really, is probably the best word. Certainly his white wines. And the reds that he does make, I think he gives them a punctuation, a precision by having that crunchiness of fruit, by again picking relatively early. Santenay, I found can be a slightly underwhelming appellation sometimes. When it's just picked a little bit late, it can become a bit loose and a bit flabby, almost lacking zip and grip. I mean, this is a really good plot. It's just, funny enough, he said, I wrote down in my notes just below, he said just above. So anyway, just next to, shall we say, Domaine, which is a really good Premier Cru. And by picking early, he's given a bit of zip into this wine. So you've still got that lovely, juicy ripeness, but you've got great energy as well. I should actually taste that before I comment too much on it. The vines here are old, which is not insignificant. I think they're about 65, 70 years old now, which again allowed them to reach maturity without sugar levels going too high, and also allowed Pommard to pick nice and early and keep the wines fresh. And it also just gave them that easy concentration that we were talking about before, where he really didn't have to push the extraction too much. Yeah, that's really nice. It's really, it's really ripe, but it's really quite cool fruit. I see there's a question coming through about whole bunch in this Santenay. It tastes like there is a little bit, but I wouldn't think there was that much. I'll perhaps get my notes while we're looking at one of the other wines. But yeah, really nice, juicy, acid Pinot, what we probably refer to as a good lunchtime Pinot, ready to drink over the next 4 or 5 years, I would say. And just a word about, I suppose, about Pommard as well. We only tasted one of his Chassans the other day. Started to get quite a few allocations of Chassans through over the last 3 days. And I was quite pleased I was sitting down when they came through. The reduction in volumes is quite frightening. Some is down as much as 70%. So we're very, very lucky that we have the likes of Pommard now as part of our portfolio, because we certainly would not have enough Chassin to go around otherwise, especially of this sort of quality. So do look out for his Chassins on this offer. It's the first time we've offered them, but sadly there won't be very many of them. But yeah, really, really nice, juicy, great value Pinot, I think that. time to move on to wine number 3. So this was the change in the order. We've moved up the Auxey-Duresses into wine number 3. And let's bring back Gilles. So he's already talked a little bit about Auxey-Duresses. Gilles, could you tell us a little bit about this vineyard, the Climat du Val?
Le Climat du Val, it's one first cru. We have 4 different first cru on the Climat du Val. It's a very nice place, south exposition, and it's for us. It's a more later maturity terroir, and it's very clear soil on brown calcaire. And for this wine in 19, where the harvest, the date is 17 of September. The shift vegetative cycle was décalé, but more later, because in April we have some frost in our village. On the harvest, we must waiting, but for this climate in 19 we have not a very hot degree, only 13 degree. It's very nice forest. On we choice to have a vinification without pigeage. We try with in 18 with this wine with the Climat du Val, and we try in 18 to start vinification without pigeage, and we have a very good result. Good, it's a good choice in the final. And for this wine, you have the good concentration for the vintage, and black fruit, little spice in smell, and it's a very elegant wine, sweet tannin, and you can keep this wine 7-10 years, no problem, but you can drink it very easy, more fast, because you have some fruit, good concentration, and very elegant tannin. It's very important with the Pinot Noir.
Normally, Gilles, you don't keep the stems. In 2019, did you think maybe I keep 20%?
No. For this wine, it's usually all distempt.
So even in this vintage, it was you preferred to destem, yeah.
Yes, but in our domain, we prefer distempt, because for me, it's not you make not wine with terroir, with stamp, because you have a best fruit, more purity fruit without the stamp. For me,
this is tasting really beautifully, lovely aromatic quality.
Yes.
Is there any new oak, any Fou Neuf there?
Not very 100 in oak, and with 25% new oak. but not fût neuf très brûlé, très grillé in French. I don't know in English.
They're not very toasty. So.
No, wait, no more toasty barrel. And we want to keep the real fruit of Pinot Noir.
Yeah. And just, I must say, I think it's showing really well, very aromatically strong, very pretty, very pure.
Yes.
Just one word before we move on, but because you also make some Auxey-Duresses Blanc with some really nice vineyards just next to Mercurey, Mes Chevaux, and how are those in 2019? They're very good.
Yes, it's a very nice vintage too in white wine. We produce some Auxey-Duresses in les Hauts, board just near to Meursault-les-Vieilles, and we produce some Auxey-Duresses les Boutonniers just near to Meursault-les-Méchaveaux. And these two different terroirs are very interesting because they stay in the start of the valley, and you have a good balance too with this wine.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you. That was really interesting. It's a shame we couldn't taste the white wines this evening, but it was great to taste this Pinot Noir, which was lovely. Thank you, Gilles.
Thank you too.
Great. So we'll move on to just again almost with you, Xavier. We've just got one more wine to do first. We're going slightly south now. We're just going into the Côte Chalonnais. So back there to Bruno's village, and we're going to be looking at the Mercurey Premier Cru Les Chassières from Vincent Charton. Who is that? Funny enough, the domains are probably about 200 yards apart, I think. This is an 8-hectare domain, I think, from memory. Predominantly Pinot Noir. He makes a tiny little bit of white wine, but really not very much. He took over. I mean, Vincent is not old. He's still a very young man, but he took over from his father, I think, almost 10 years ago. So he'd have barely been out of nappies by the time he started making wine. Interesting. He's one of those quietly ambitious people, and I think he hasn't gone in and changed everything that his father used to do. It's just been a gradual change, as we say, evolution rather than revolution. But I say it doesn't mean he's not ambitious. He's just in the process of building a brand new winery. So that will hopefully be completed just in time for next year's harvest. And it will be interesting to see if he changes any of his vinification techniques as a result of having a new cuvée. We've seen that at places like Gouges, when they finished in 2007, how they were able to do much more by gravity. And it'll be interesting to see if Vincent goes down that route. So the wine we're tasting from him is one of several Premier Crus he makes. Mercurey Premier Cru La Chassière. This is made from a vineyard that's planted, I think, about 55 years ago. So again, nice old vines which will handle the extremes of heat that we saw and the dryness in 2019. There's about 25% new oak on here, but one of the really important element is the amount of whole bunch. And certainly in his father's, I don't think Vincent's father ever used stems at all. Gradually, Vincent has introduced those, and he just increased them a little bit in 2019. So we're up close to probably 50%. I think it's quite an interesting thing to do in Mercurey, which can be at times a little bit rustic as an appellation, a little bit earthy. There's quite a lot of clay in much of Mercurey. And actually adding a little bit of precision, freshness, just to lift the wines, which the whole bunches in theory might well do, I think is probably a good thing, and probably a really good thing in a vintage like 2019. yeah, slightly darker fruits than normal, but still very pretty, quite pure, no heaviness. Actually, a really nice lightness of touch. I think that's probably the whole bunch is doing that little bit there. Just keeping it very lifted, very fresh, very vibrant. No sense of rusticity at all. It's probably fair to say Mercurey is yet another village that is enjoying this global warming that we're all experiencing at the moment. Just helping to produce slightly more sophisticated tannins, which we're seeing obviously in Pommard and up in the Haute-Côte and in Auxey-Duresses and places like that. And that's certainly true here. I think they've been nicely integrated. Yeah, I mean, actually quite accessible. This is one of the few wines I think we're tasting this evening that has been bottled, and it's still in that slightly open phase at the moment. Possibly it will shut down a little bit, but I think that will probably be drinking really well in about 18 months, 2 years time, and then for another 5, 6, 7 years. I mean, these well-balanced wines, they always go on much longer than you might think, especially if you drink them straight from the Domaine. You always say if you're given a blind wine at the Domaine, guess what vintage it is, and then add on about 10 years, because you always, if you say what you actually think it is, you're always going to be miles out. They're always much older than you think, because they've never moved and they've been stuck in these cold cellars for a long time. I think that's a really nice glass of Mercurey. And I understand what you were saying earlier about whether, you know, what these wines were like maybe 20 years ago. I don't remember many Mercuries tasting like that back in the day. And I think...
What was it a case that in good vintages Mercurey tasted like this?
Yeah, I think it was that you would get all that earthiness and rusticity and not much else. And winemakers have this strange idea that it would be a good idea to cover it all up with new oak. So you end up getting not only having rusticity, but heavily oaky wines as well. And given about a year or two post-bottling, the wines would become very dry. So slightly unripe tannins and oak tannins together. And so, yeah, the wines would just slowly lose their fruit and you'd be left with something not very appealing. Because this has all that ripeness that you want, but at the same time, lovely finesse and great integration of tannins. The oak is really well handled, I think. And that's just a really nice balanced glass of Pinot Noir. I think, as I say, Vincent is still a very young man, and I think this is a domain certainly to keep a really close eye on, especially with the new Cuvée. So there we go. That's the Mercurey. So let's move on to wine number 5, and let's bring Xavier back, if we may. Welcome back, Xavier. Yeah, hopefully we'll just unmute. We talked briefly already this evening about the effect on certain appellations of these warmer summers, and I think Jasper actually said it's not just the warmer summers but the warmer winters as well, which have an important role. You've only been making wine really since 2014, I suppose, since you stopped being a fighter pilot, a Tom Cruise of Pommard. Have you seen differences even in that short space of time with the quality of tannins, the ripeness levels that you're getting from your vineyards?
Yes, there are maybe the big tannin I could encounter was in 2014. It was I had to be very careful about the tannin, but remember also that the sun also help us to give us soft tannin quickly. So even if the extraction has to be managed, because we need less of pigeage and we do more pump over, also the sun gives us best tannin. So we don't have to search those tannin, but also they come quicker, but they are best than previous. So I could see between those different vintage I have made the difference of the tannins, the quality of the tannins. But I can say that from 2014, there were no rough tannin. You could get too much into the extraction, yes, but it's not it's not such a bad deal because the tannin were not so bad. And also all those villages that had the combe, a valley, like Gilles said, who were very influenced by the cold that coming, which was the case of Pommard. Take a lot of benefits of those global warming. Another time, we hope that it won't increase, sure, but for us, it's a very good benefit.
Yes, I think someone, I can't remember if it was this evening or last week, but someone mentioned not only the quality of fruit, but the health of the grapes. The lack of disease has been fantastic. No, but I think what you're saying about this freedom to do more gentle extraction because the ripeness is there already is probably the most important change I think we've seen in Burgundy in the last 5 years. Just one question before we talk about this specific wine. You have used whole bunch, haven't you, sometimes, but not in the last couple of years. Were you tempted to use it again in 19?
No, because I made some tests and I saw that below 50%, the taste, the real benefit of the whole bench is not so good. You really need to go a full vat of whole bench. It's how to make a good whole bench. But when you have good yield, it's very difficult if you don't have a big cellar to make a full vat of whole bench. So as I am starting, I think I'm now focused on doing the best and stop the test and doing the best on this team, and maybe I'll come back a day, but trying to do a full vat whole bench. But you need to be focused on priority.
Maybe when you bought some more vineyards, you can. When you bought some more, some Clos de Bez or something. But,
oh yes.
So
a lot of comments here, Xavier, if I may interrupt. People are commenting on the salinity of the wines with the fruitiness as well. Pepperiness, very positive comments on them. One question for you, though, is, which we've touched on in past tastings, is the balance between the terroir and the vintage itself. Given it's a warm vintage, one could think that you would get more of the vintage characteristics, but the sense is that terroir really is coming out in 19. I wonder if I could ask you to comment on that a little bit.
Yeah, sure. The terroir is has the yield was lower. You feel the terroir because you feel the difference between the difference between all Auxey is in phases. You really see the difference between a wine to another. So I can say that the terroir express itself. Also the age of the vine, because when you have low yield and very dry climate, the young vine has a lot of are really impacted by the dryness. So when you have the chance to have old vine, I think with the big roots, they can really express the difference between clay and limestone, the strengths of the wine in clay, the fine thing that gives limestone. So sure, in 2019, the terroir will be really present. Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. Thank you for that. So obviously the other day we tasted the Pommard Chaponière, This Pommard Perrieres is your largest holding. It's almost half of the domain, isn't it? At 2 hectares. Soil. You find in such a big vineyard, do you have a consistency in the soil type? Is it all the same, or do you have little variations?
Yeah, you focus on a very interesting point. When you have 2 hectares on a single AOC, on a single also lieu-dit, which is Les Perrieres, because of the real importance of the amount of the stones in Les Perrieres, which gives a bit of limestone in this deeper soil, village deeper soil. In 2 hectares, you have differences. I think I could make almost 4 wine in this parcel, but it's not possible. But what I'm dealing with this, because I always harvest in two different time. There is the place which is closer from the trees. There is a lot of trees on the south part. I'm going at the end to have the maximum maturity. So when I start to harvest, I start by Les Perrieres. I fill a vat of Les Perrieres. I go to fetch the other vine, and at the end, I'm coming back to Les Perrieres to give a lot of time to the part which has some shade on it.
Oh, interesting. So maybe one day you will make a specific cuvée from just one part, from one little part of Pommard. Maybe one day.
Yeah, it could be interesting just to taste. I've tasted the differences, but only during vinification. I never went during the élevage. I blended earlier, yeah. But during the vinification, I really taste the differences.
I also noticed when I've been standing in the vineyard that it seems quite a sandy soil vineyard in parts. Is that the case? In
Les Perrieres, not so much sand. You can have some really broken stone in little part because there were a lot of stone in this part, and at the time with broken parts, you can have but not so sandy.
And in terms of yields on this wine, quantities are quite a lot down, aren't they? Are you about 30% down? Or?
Yes, in Les Perrieres, it was impacted because it's the place where I suffer from a bit of dryness, because the wine. Remember that Les Perrieres was planted in 1902. So I suffer from dryness in this wine because there are some young plants now that I try to put every day, every year, but I have less plant than anywhere else because I was focused on planting new plants in the Premier Crus and Grand Cru because it was the priority. So in Les Perrieres, I have less plant in the vine. So when there is a high climate, high temperature climate, the first vine that suffer from a lower yield is Les Perrieres because it's old, because it's big. So I was not focused in renewing the.
Yeah, it's always a very difficult decision to pull up the vines when they're 102 years old and to plant new ones. What a great history of that vineyard. Someone's commented, actually it was Sam, but tasting a Pommard that is not even bottled, but it's so delicious, and the tannins are so integrated and juicy. This is not a Pommard that one would have tasted 20 years ago.
Yeah, sure that there is some movement in this way for all the growers, and as I was saying, we are really taking benefits. Pommard was always a cold climate with the impact of the corn we have, and now we all have the tools to be able to make Pommard other thing that a wine only built to age with a hard and sometimes rough tannin. Now we are really able to do really elegant wine in Pommard.
Yeah, it's certainly that. Last question, Xavier. Is 19 the best? Are they the best wines you've made?
No, it's 2020.
Good answer. Good answer. Well, this is pretty good. So thank you, Xavier. We'll leave that there with you. But that's terrific. And for a village wine, really great.
Thank you very much.
Well, we just crack on. We're just getting towards the end of the hour now. So crack on with the last wine. I'm afraid I'm not the sort of young, glamorous Thibaut Clerget that you were expecting. So you'll have to make do with me, but we do at least have his wine, which is arguably the most important thing. I'm afraid you probably only got a small amount in your little pot, because we weren't able to get hold of many bottles because Thibaut's volumes were incredibly low, down 50%, 60, 70% in places. This particular vineyard, he normally makes 12 barrels, he made 7 in 2019. So, quick maths, that's about 40% down on normal. Having said that, the wines are really good. Just a little bit of history just before we go on to it. So, Thibaut's father stopped making his last vintage of 2009. And then had a period where they were selling grapes off to negociants while Thibaut went and did his sort of wine studies. He then came back in 2015 and to produce his first vintage. He's got 6 hectares in total, mainly in Volnay. He makes a little Pommard, a little bit of Meursault from memory, and then he's got a really nice plot of Clos Vougeot. Probably shouldn't say this, but his Clos Vougeot in 19 is extraordinary. Clos Vougeot actually is an appellation in 19, like the difficult appellations we've mentioned before, that have really flourished in this warm vintage. Clos Vougeot is fantastic in 19. Sadly, I can't remember how many, he's made something like 2 barrels of Clos Vougeot in 19. But anyway, but his real focus is Volnay. This is a Monopole vineyard, Clos de Verseuil, which is just next to Perrieres, so right in the middle of the village. Really, really nice plot. Old vines, and no whole bunch, interestingly. Xavier, sorry, not Xavier. Sorry, Xavier. Thibaut is often uses whole bunch, and did do on quite a lot of his wines in 2019, but chose not to on this particular cuvée. Not quite sure why. But it's, I mean, you can see already the concentration of that. I'm not surprised that he lost 40% of the vineyard, of the production. Again, we've spoken about it this evening, a lot of small berries, so a lot of natural concentration there. He harvested at the correct date, that sweet spot. I think he started on 13th of September. He'd have probably taken 4 or 5 days to go through the vineyard. But there's still some aromatics there. There's a mix of some red, black, and blue fruits, I think, going on. Yeah. I mean, in a way, that's quite powerful for Volnay. Generally, you think of Volnays as being very, very elegant and pretty. This certainly has some stuffing to it. I don't think it's heavy. I think there's still that lovely freshness and balance, but it's certainly got plenty of matière. And this is a Volnay that should age really, really well. Again, I think it's that natural concentration. he hasn't had to force anything. He said the colours came very easily, the tannins came very easily. As Xavier mentioned, you know, in this vintage, you really didn't have to force anything. Most people reduced Pigeards, didn't bother. Some just a little bit at the end of the fermentation.
Some have said this is the vintage where the wines won't shut down. Is this Volnay in that category, or are we slightly differently here?
Really hard to say. When I was tasting there, I did ask that question quite a lot. A lot of the growers are probably in the camp that maybe they won't, particularly. I just thought with such concentration, they've got to shut down for a little bit. If you take a vintage like 17, which was just gorgeous, kind of gorgeous in barrel, gorgeous already in bottle, I don't think they're going to shut down. They're going to be a bit like the 85s, which aged beautifully but were delicious. So I gather, because it's before my time from day one. But I think there's so much matter in these wines and concentration that they probably will go to sleep for a little bit. But there's so much fruit as well. So will they really shut down? They won't. Even if they shut down, I don't think there'll be any harshness. I think you'll still be able to see how good they are and where they're going. And that's a really good example. I mean, it fills your mouth with fruit. But if you want that nuance and complexity, then you will need to give it time. But there'll never be that harshness because the tannins are so ripe. The acidity levels are good, but they're not overwhelming. So yeah, there's no. I don't think you'll get a very angular wine at any stage. You'll just get something that needs more time. Probably
you mentioned the 17s. Will they take on weight?
I'm sure they will.
Okay.
If we look back at 2007, which was a vintage that was considered really quite light, they called it a restaurant vintage at the time, and the wines they're still putting on weight even now after 12, 13 years. Actually, it's ended up being a much more serious vintage than I think we all thought. 17 is a better vintage, there's better ripeness, better phenolic ripeness. So yeah, I mean, I think 17 will probably remain highly underrated because it came after 16, which was also fantastic, and it came after 18s with these sort of big, slightly bigger, showier wines. But I think for Pinot the 17 is stunning. But then you could apply that to 19 if you like Pinot. You know, real pure Pinot with aromatic qualities. 19 is also fantastic. So that's the Clerget wine really. I mean, pretty serious, I think. But again, just very, very little of it. If he had another 20 hectares, it would be great. But sadly, when you've only got 6 hectares and you lose 40–50% of your crop, not much you can do really.
Thank you, Jason. Huge thank you to Gilles and to Xavier for tonight. Fascinating tasting, and it brings to an end our series of tastings. Tonight was on value, so for the first time I've tried to type away at the prices to give you an idea in your minds, and for me, wow, there really are some great value wines here. Xavier's Perrieres springs to mind. It's a euphemism in the wine trade that a wine merchant is repositioning a wine, and that pretty much means they're knocking up the price upwards by 40%. Looking at 189, I genuinely think this is 15–20% cheaper than the wine was about 4 years ago, and for the quality in this vintage, it does look like a fantastic wine to me. So from here on, the final tasting. Thank you for those who've joined us, for many of them. Jason gets a break now. He gets a rest. Well, he doesn't get much of a rest. He now gets put to work, and for the first time, we are trying to get the offer out to be with you on the 27th of December. So plenty of work for Jason. And just after Christmas, we will have the full offer, Domaine Direct, Jason's finds in Burgundy. It will be our largest and most exciting offer ever. So I very much look forward to that. And thank you to everyone.